The territory of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union that was formed from it in 1922 comprised the largest country on Earth. Stretching from Eastern Europe across Asia to the Pacific Ocean, this vast land, more than 8.5 million square miles, was known for immense distances and a harsh climate, that made communication and transportation difficult, sometimes impossible. In the 19th century, railways revolutionized the world. But no country was more profoundly affected by the development of railways than the Russian Empire. Many of the major rivers of Russia's vast Eurasian expanse flow north and empty into the Arctic Ocean. But for exploration and settlement to take place from west to east, man-made routes were necessary. Railways followed the movement of people and became the most important connection between the city and the countryside, between agricultural products and their markets, and between natural resources and industry. Russia's early cast-iron road was the starting point for the Industrial Revolution and the dramatic changes in the country that would follow. In 1834, 9 years after the world's first public railway had been laid in England, Yefim Cherepanov and his son Miron privately built a steam engine and a railway in the Russian city of Nizhny Tagil. Three years later, the tireless Austrian engineer Franz Anton Hössner persisted and obtained Emperor Nicholas I's permission to try a new means of transportation in Russia. On October the 30th, 1837, 300 nobles departed from St. Petersburg in 8 coaches for a trip on the newly constructed line to the emperor's suburban palace in Tsarskoye Selo. With Hössner at the controls, the train made the 16-mile journey in less than 30 minutes. Its speed, of almost 30 miles per hour, seemed unbelievable. Russia became the first country to have a government-subsidized railway program. Hössner's single-track railroad was a toy for the wealthy, but a functional rail system would soon follow. Train engines were compared to sailing vessels. Known as ground ships, they were imported from Western Europe. Each was custom-built and had its own name. Instead of tickets, passengers received brass tags. These tags were collected after each trip and reused. Early railway stations were magnificent works of architecture. The terminal in the imperial residence of Pavlovsk was also a concert hall, where famous musicians including Johann Strauss and Fyodor Shaliapin performed. Russia's first major railway venture linked Moscow and St. Petersburg. The new line, called the Nicholas Railway, was laid mainly for strategic purposes. It was designed by Pavel Melnikov. In 1842, 2 5-foot-wide tracks were laid simultaneously from each city. 9 years later, the tracks were joined at the Bologoye station, midway on the 403-mile route. The railway was a unique feat of engineering, the largest double-track railroad in the world. The construction went on under adverse geological and climatic conditions. 252 man-made structures had to be built, including 184 bridges. station buildings were constructed of stone. The railway terminals in Moscow and St. Petersburg were identical. Rolling stock was domestically manufactured. In 1846, at the Alexander Works in St. Petersburg, the first Russian passenger steam locomotive and the first freight steam engine were built. Initially, the journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow took 21 hours and 45 minutes. But within a few years, the trip was shortened to 12 hours, amazing the travelers of the day. Railway design engineering became a popular profession. The Institute of Engineers of Communications, originally founded in 1809 as a military school and supervised by the emperor, became a prestigious educational institution. Renowned for its high standards, the institute attracted university graduates and outstanding instructors, including the great chemist Dmitri Mendeleev. The institute's graduates greatly contributed to the development of Russia's railways in the 19th century. Railroad lines quickly became commonplace, and tracks were extended from Russia's main cities, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Riga. Soon the Moscow-Kursk and the Nizhny Novgorod railways, the North Railway, the Riga-Dinaburg, and the Baltic railways linked points in European Russia. The abolition of serfdom in 1861 allowed railway construction to flourish, using the newly available labor force. From the 1850s until the 1880s, 19,000 miles of railway lines were constructed. The longest line, the Trans-Caspian Railway, stretched 870 miles. Its construction started in 1880 to transport military supplies to Central Asia. It was the world's first railroad construction in the desert. The Russian railway in Asia would supply half of the country's demand for cotton. By the 1890s, railway travel had become the most popular and comfortable means of transportation in Russia. During 1893, Russian trains transported 54 million passengers. By 1913, the number was 5 times greater. The train became more important than the horse-drawn coach, and the stations and station squares became centers of activity in cities and towns. These 4-axle CH series steam engines were the most widely used type in the last quarter of the 19th century. The bulge on the chimney functioned as a spark arrestor for fire control. Railroad tracks remained in service indefinitely. Rails on the most heavily traveled roadbeds were replaced and reused in areas with less traffic. In the late 1920s, the original track connecting Novgorod and Staraya Russa was relocated to the Solovki Islands, the site of one of Stalin's first labor camps. Late in the 19th century, planning began for the most famous of all Russian railways, the Great Siberian Way. Spanning the entire Asian continent from Vladivostok in the Far East to Chelyabinsk in the Ural Mountains. Before the Trans-Siberian Railway was constructed, most Russians believed the vast expanses of Siberia would prove impossible to cross by rail. The Trans-Siberian Railway Construction Committee was chaired by future Emperor Nicholas II. Russia's renowned statesmen, Sergei Witte and Pyotr Stolypin, sponsored the project. The first section near Vladivostok commenced in 1891. When the line was completed 10 years later, it linked Moscow and Vladivostok, a distance of 5,543 miles. Until the 1920s, the Trans-Siberian Railway was the longest in the world. The passenger who traveled the entire route crossed 8 time zones on his 12-day journey. Long-distance travel required changes to make passengers more comfortable. Many Russian passenger coaches became models for the rest of the world. Lounges in first-class carriages were decorated in the style of luxurious country estates. Buffets and dining rooms were supplied from well-stocked kitchens managed by excellent chefs. Cars were equipped with washrooms, saunas, laundries, and special exercise equipment. The trains of the new railway transported masses of peasants resettling in Siberia. Within 20 years, almost 5 million settlers left the European part of Russia. They were allowed to choose parcels of land in Siberia, received a tax exemption, and paid only a quarter fare. Agricultural products and furs exported from Siberia would bring Russia more gold than the mining operations. The conditions during the construction were harsh. Workers were recruited from the poorer provinces. Thousands of miles away from home, they lived in tents or earthen dugouts. Heavy equipment was in short supply. Hard manual labor in the brutal Siberian climate, poor diet, and lack of medical care resulted in a high death rate. There were 80,000 laborers and 6,000 employees. Annually, more than 400 miles of rails were laid at twice the cost per mile as in European Russia. Work was hampered by erratic deliveries of construction material, shipped great distances by horse-drawn carriages. Siberia's geography created formidable difficulties. The waterways intersecting the route posed challenges for Russia's bridge builders. Their solutions resulted in brilliant new forms of bridge design. Their bridges still exist after a century of use. A model of the bridge over the Yenisei River won a gold medal at a 1900 exhibition in Paris. Lake Baikal, the world's biggest freshwater lake, was a huge obstacle. 2 English icebreakers ferried cargo and passengers until the round Baikal section was opened in 1904. Carving this short section out of solid rock proved a hard task. The railway builders also had to overcome wild taiga, swamps and mountains, severe winters and short summers, destructive floods, and finally, the permafrost which covers about a third of Russia's territory. Construction on the Trans-Siberian Railroad was suspended several times because of manpower shortages. Thousands of convicts and exiles were conscripted for the project, and many locals volunteered to help. Railway laborers became a huge populating factor for distant reaches of Siberia. The numerous train depots and workshops along the railway were a major source of employment and income. New orphanages, Churches and hospitals were built in the local communities. The railway dramatically improved the communication across Russian Asia. During the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, Russia and China agreed to allow Russian railroad builders to lay a rail line across Manchuria. The scope of this 5-year project and its rapid completion made the Chinese Eastern Railway a significant achievement in railroad engineering. In 1916, with the completion of the Trans-Siberian and the opening of the Amur line, the major sections of Russia's territory had effectively been connected. The Trans-Siberian Railroad established Russia as a major railway power. Alexander III was Tsar when the railroad was begun. A commemorative statue of the emperor was commissioned. Ironically, Alexander III was involved in one of the worst train disasters of the 19th century. In 1888, the train carrying the Tsar and his family from the Black Sea to St. Petersburg jumped the track, traveling at speeds of over 25 miles per hour. The train was overloaded, and the stretch of track between Kharkov and Kursk needed repair. Several carriages were demolished, 19 people died, and 14 others were seriously injured. Fortunately, the royal family came out unscathed. A number of factors contributed to an increase of train accidents. The profits from railway operations were diverted, leaving repairs and maintenance neglected. Several serious accidents were caused by alcohol abuse among train personnel. By the early 20th century, Russian railroad accidents numbered in the hundreds, claiming more than 100,000 victims every year. Incredibly, these facts neither slowed construction nor dampened public support. The development of industry and trade was dependent upon the railways. The opening of every new line drew enthusiastic crowds. Russia's success in railroad construction confirmed the popular belief in man's capacity to master nature. In fact, railroad construction was a testament to human ingenuity. Russia's terrain posed almost impossible difficulties, calling for new engineering solutions, especially in the remote areas of Transcaucasia, Karelia, and the Amur region. Tunnels were a necessity on mountain railways, and many were engineering marvels. The Soram Tunnel, completed in the Caucasus in 1890, 2.5 miles long, was the most famous. The 35 feet of tunnel track laid every day set a world standard. The construction took 4 years and cost 5 million golden rubles. The Great Hingan Tunnel, almost 2 miles long, was completed in 15 months, an unbelievable pace for that time. Russian engineers continued to design innovative structures. Vladimir Shukov was considered Russia's most talented engineer. He designed more than 400 bridges and other structures, including the Kiev terminal in Moscow. He was also involved in the construction of the Moscow Circle between 1898 and 1908. The railway surrounding the city was 31 miles long and cost 40 million rubles to build. As Moscow expanded, the line was absorbed into the intra-city rail system. The steam engine industry grew along with the construction of the railway lines. By the 1860s, the production of both engines and carriages was a thriving enterprise. This was largely due to the prohibition by Minister of Communication Means, Pavel Melnikov, of foreign steam locomotives in Russia. By the beginning of this century, about 20 major Russian plants produced steam engines and rolling stock. The legendary O-series engines, designed in 1893, were the workhorses of Russia's railroad system for decades. These 500 horsepower engines were light and maneuverable. They were equipped with the so-called double expansion system, saving a great amount of steam. Within 20 years, 10,000 of these models were manufactured. The N-series engine, designed at the same time with a greater horsepower, was used for passenger trains. It had 3 driving axles and wheels over 6 feet in diameter. One of the popular engines on the Nicholas Railway was the S engine, renowned for high speed. On October 6, 1913, an S engine with 9 cars traveled from Moscow to St. Petersburg in 7 hours, 59 minutes, a record for the time. Like the S engine, the B-series engine, first built in 1908, was designed for express trains. The B had a forward driving axle. Though slower than the S, the B engine performed better on hilly terrain. A year earlier, the SH-CH engine had been introduced. With its 700 horsepower, the engine powered a freight train hauling 800 tons at high speed. The engine with the most longevity was the powerful E-series, with 5 driving axles. The design was so successful that these engines were modified and produced for 45 years, until the very end of the steam engine era. When the Civil War halted engine manufacture during the early 1920s, the E-series engines were produced in Sweden and Germany. 1,200 of these engines were constructed and shipped to Russia. World War I, and to a larger extent the Civil War of 1917, stalled railroad development in Russia. During the First World War, railways near the front were damaged, but not irreparably, and rail transport of men and material continued on schedule. New lines were planned to supply the front. The German naval blockade of Russia's Baltic seaports forced the government to order the building of a line north to the port of Murmansk. This hastily built railway was the only project completed during the war. Captured Prussian army soldiers were used as laborers. War also expanded the functions of trains. Medical trains were introduced. Their activities were supervised by Grand Princess Yelizaveta Fyodorovna and State Duma Deputy Vladimir Purishkevich. During the Civil War, as As medical supplies dwindled, the Bolsheviks equipped some of the medical trains as propaganda trains. They distributed tons of printed material. Some of Russia's best artists, who had sided with the Bolsheviks, painted the train exteriors. They created moving exhibitions of political posters. Entire galleries were housed inside the cars. Flatbeds were turned into theater stages. However, the dissemination of propaganda was not the most important function of trains during the war. Between 1918 and 1921, armored trains proved to be highly effective weapons. During an early stage of the conflict, known as the Echelon War, every railway line and every platform had strategic significance, and fierce fighting occurred along the railroads. A major part of Russia's rolling stock and railway stations was destroyed. 46,500 miles of rail lines, hundreds of locomotives and cars, 3,500 steel trussed bridges, and more. The Bolsheviks acknowledged the importance of railroads to the war. Trains were often the background for filming Red military leaders. Podvoisky, Batsetis, Tukhachevsky, Kamenev, and Lev Trotsky. He had a specially equipped train at his disposal. Trotsky, who commanded the Red Army, was briefly the People's Commissar of Communications Means and used his oratory to encourage Russia's railroad workers. Trotsky was succeeded as People's Commissar of Communications Means by the head of the Cheka, Felix Dzerzhinsky. The Civil War severely damaged Russia's communication and transportation network. Only half of the country's steam locomotives survived. For miles along the railway lines, trees had been cut for fuel. Regularly scheduled transportation was impossible. A Bolshevik program to channel public enthusiasm and use volunteer communist labor was implemented to repair the railroads. Inspired by Bolshevik slogans, workers repaired locomotives during off hours without payment. One of these engines is a museum exhibit. Workers appointed Lenin, this locomotive's honorary engineer. When Lenin died in January 1924, this engine pulled the carriage with Lenin's body from his country home in Gorky to Moscow. Riding a wave of Bolshevik enthusiasm, the railway system developed rapidly during the decades between the world wars. Settlement of huge areas of the country continued, encouraged by a new official ideology known as path-breaking, and by the industrial and cultural assimilation of remote regions. The process was also aided by a colonial romanticism that revolved around conquest of the taiga, the tundra, and the mountains. New railways were laid in the Far East, the Caucasus, the European North, and Siberia. The Turkestan-Siberian Railway was one of the largest construction projects of the Soviet Union's first five-year plan. Prior to the building of the Turk-Sib, major railway lines extended from Russia's European urban centers to the provinces. But the Turkestan-Siberian Railway, begun in 1927, symbolized a new stage in Russian railway development. More than 900 miles of track would connect two vast and still sparsely populated regions, Western Siberia and Central Asia. The line crossed steppes and deserts, where summer temperatures exceeded 60 degrees Celsius, while winter temperatures dropped below minus 40 degrees Celsius in blizzard conditions. Track was laid from the Lugovaya station on the border of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzia, and from Semipalatinsk, a remote town which would become a major Asian railway hub and port on the Irtysh River. The early enthusiasm of the builders was tempered by a lack of equipment. A year later, in 1928, 17 imported excavators were shipped to the construction site, along with tipping wagons and explosives. Still, most of the excavation was done manually, with shovels, pickaxes, and horse-drawn carts. After 3 years, tracks from the north and the south were connected. Because Soviet ideology required that the achievements of the state be ascribed to the heroic efforts of the proletarian masses, the designers of the Turkestan-Siberian Railroad were not introduced when the line was formally opened. Official propaganda also dictated that the railway be viewed as a source of happiness for the ignorant and backward people of Turkestan. Thousands of miles of track were laid by the most primitive of methods, before technology intervened. Vladimir Platov's rail layer, first used in 1935 on the construction of the Katali-Akmolinsk line in Siberia, enabled builders to put down almost 5 miles of track in 8 hours, 2.5 times the manual rate. Locomotives were upgraded. The most functional engine inherited by the Bolsheviks was the S-series. Its modification, SU series steam engine, was considered one of the world's best. Like the older E-series engine, it was in service for a long time, built from 1925 until 1950. During the 1930s, trains were named in honor of Bolshevik leaders. The Kharkov plant manufactured locomotives designated SO for Sergo Ordzhonikidze, Stalin's friend and supporter. The SO engine with a tender condenser was designed specially for arid areas. Felix Dzerzhinsky's initials identified engines assembled in the Lugansk plant. The huge 3,000 horsepower FD series freight engine was assembled in only 170 days. Each engine had a 25-ton coal capacity. The FD was equipped with an automatic coal-stoking device. The citizens celebrated the arrival of one of the earliest FDs at the Kiev railway terminal in Moscow. The IS steam engine for passenger train use was first put into service in 1932. The IS was a 3,000 horsepower engine, like the FD, but it was 50% faster. In the decade before World War II, several subtypes of this engine named for Joseph Stalin were designed. In 1937, two locomotives, the FD and the IS, were displayed at the World Technical Exhibition in Paris as examples of Soviet engineering achievement. The IS-16, a later version of the IS series, was equipped with an aerodynamic cowling, allowing it to reach even higher speeds. A similarly designed engine set a new speed record, 111.6 miles per hour. During the 1930s, the quest to break records became a national obsession in the Soviet Union. Beyond streamlining existing engines, designers embarked upon more daring projects. On Nikolai Yarmolchuk's spheric train, built in 1930, wheels were replaced with spheres that rolled along grooved track. Because this project and others necessitated the construction of new tracks, they were abandoned as impractical. Many successful innovations were neither exotic or expensive. Engineer Pyotr Krivonos drove his FD locomotive with a reinforced boiler, pulling heavy freight rolling stock at twice the normal speed. Alexander Popavin, an engine operator, attempted to drive his engine 620,000 miles, 1 million kilometers, without an overhaul. Valentin Makarov's 12,400-mile journey throughout the country with only the briefest stops to refill the water tank was compared to a non-stop flight by the news media. Proof of the SO engine's reliability. Women had a role in Russia's railroad history. In the 1930s, Zinaida Troitskaya became the first Soviet woman engineer. She was part of the women's movement for entrance into male professions. Before the revolution, women were often employed as laborers on railway construction. During World War I, with most men in military service, women became the labor pool for the exhausting excavations necessary for the railway's survival. After the October Revolution, women were officially emancipated, but their newfound freedom meant little more than an official sanction for difficult menial labor. During the Civil War, women were involved in combat. Ludmila Makaevskaya commanded an armored train. She was killed in action. throughout the 1920s and 30s, it was commonplace to see women performing hard labor on numerous construction sites. When World War II began, men returned to the front. Women repaired thousands of miles of railway lines. 85% of all cargo in the Soviet Union was carried by railways. During the war, railways played a vital role, linking the 2,500 miles of front line to the rear. It was an enormous task. The evacuations of entire industrial enterprises were done by rail. Manpower and equipment were transported during emergency conditions. The fronts needed to be supplied regardless of the cost. As in earlier wars, some of the system's rolling stock was converted into armored trains that took an active part in combat action. The railways virtually saved the besieged cities: Leningrad, Stalingrad, Kiev. Leningrad's only ties to the outside were a road on the frozen Ladoga Lake and the Corridor of Death, a railway line under constant fire and used only at night. Russia's railways were heavily damaged during the war. They were bombed by Luftwaffe pilots and blown up by the guerrilla units fighting the Nazis. Sections of the railways were destroyed both by retreating Nazi forces and advancing Soviet troops. Damage was far more extensive than that of the Civil War. 13,000 bridges and thousands of miles of tracks had been destroyed. The effects of the war on Russia's railways were long-lasting. Militarism in the rail system remained after the war. Railwaymen wore army-style uniforms and were organized in a military fashion. Absolute obedience to orders was mandatory. Discipline among the railway troops was even stricter. These troops repaired the railways and built new lines. When the war ended, these troops continued to operate in a military fashion, rebuilding destroyed railway lines, bridges, and stations. There is very little film footage of the senseless human sacrifice practiced in the labor camps. Construction of the never-completed Salakhard-Igaka line running along the Arctic Circle was terminated only after Stalin's death. Thousands of convicts' lives and billions of rubles were wasted. After the war, thousands of young idealistic communists, drawn to the wilderness by romantic notions, volunteered their labor and constructed thousands of miles of railway lines. The largest railway project of the after-war years was the 2,500-mile Southern Siberian line. Running parallel to the Trans-Siberian, it connected the coal mines of Kuzbass with the foundries of the southern Urals. During the Khrushchev administration, the line between Abakan and Taishet was built as part of the 1958 seven-year plan. It connected the Southern Siberian line with the Trans-Siberian. The fully electrified line signaled the end of the steam era. Russia's last production steam locomotive was Lev Lebedyansky's L series. The first experimental models, known as Pobyeda, or Victory, were produced in the early post-war years and had a 2,000 horsepower engine. Continuing attempts were made to design and build an even more powerful engine. One was 4,000 horsepower, with 20 times the power of the early steam engines. Yet the locomotive was outdated, and in the 1950s, after 135 years of dominance, the steam engine was replaced with the diesel and electric locomotives. The first diesel locomotive was designed by Yakov Gakov, who was also a successful aircraft designer. The engine was built back in 1924 at 3 of Petrograd's largest factories, the Putilov, the Boltiisky, and the Electric, from old car parts. The core diesel was taken from a submarine. In 1925, Yuri Lomonosov's diesel engine was assembled in Germany under his supervision. The first diesels operated in the Soviet Union, but few saw their potential. Railroad manufacturing plants were not equipped for large-scale production. Lazar Kaganovich, People's Commissar for Communication Means, turned a blind eye and remained an adherent of the steam engine. While the FD steam engine attracted attention in Moscow, the new diesel remained almost unnoticed. But within a quarter century, diesel and electric engines would replace steam engines on Russia's railways. Almost simultaneously with the advent of the diesel locomotive, the electrification of the Soviet railways began. The first line was electrified in 1926 in the Caucasus, near Baku. In 1929, electric lines linked Moscow with its closest suburbs. By the end of the 30s, 1,240 miles of railway lines had been electrified. However, the widespread use of electricity on Soviet railways did not begin until the second half of this century. Soviet-made electric locomotives were designated the VL, Vladimir Lenin series. The latest model, the ER-200, built in Riga and capable of speeds of 124 miles per hour, is used on the Moscow-St. Petersburg line. This is the fastest train operating on the Russian railways. In the 1970s, construction was begun on the most modern long-distance line, the Baikal-Amur Railway, known as BAM. The project, dubbed the construction of the century by the news media, was a favorite of Brezhnev. BAM's history predated Brezhnev by almost 100 years. Plans had been discussed during the building of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Formidable technical and economic obstacles caused the plan to be rejected. Because of its proximity to the increasingly unfriendly China, the Trans-Siberian Railway was to be replaced with a safer route. In the 1930s, the Baikal-Amur Railway was proposed. Construction on the line was begun and then suspended during World War II. Part of the track, laid at an enormous cost in human life, was removed and reused on the frontline railways near Stalingrad. Deteriorating relations between Russia and China in the 1960s led to a decision to resume construction on the BAM. Actual work was begun in 1974. About 2,500 miles of track was needed, and work continued for 10 years. Construction practices were slipshod and jeopardized the safety of both the project and the workers. Because of the line's substandard quality, the first trains on the BAM line in 1984 would only be operated at low speed. Normal travel on the single-track line is still impossible. During the Soviet era, more freight was hauled on the 87,000 miles of the Soviet rail system than anywhere else in the world. Only the United States has more track. For a century and a half, Russia's railroad system, a transportation and communication network with its own distinctive character and image, has been an integral part of Russia's history.